Doctors shocked when woman delivers a baby with glowing eyes. How is this even possible? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The hospital was bustling with activity that morning. Nurses were rushing between rooms, doctors were reviewing patient files, and the air buzzed with the quiet hum of machines monitoring lives. Among the crowd of patients was Elisa Martinez, a 29-year-old first-time mother, waiting nervously in her private room. It was her due date, and while most pregnancies came with their fair share of nerves, Elisa's case was unique. The doctors had been monitoring her closely for months, and though everything seemed normal in her scans, there had always been an unspoken air of mystery surrounding her baby. Elisa had felt something peculiar throughout her pregnancy, dreams that seemed more like visions, feelings of intense energy emanating from her belly, and an overwhelming sense that her child was different. She had brought these concerns up during her appointments, but every test and ultrasound returned unremarkable results. The doctors, though curious, assured her that it was nothing to worry about. Yet, Elisa couldn't shake the feeling. Her husband, Marco, paced the room, trying to mask his anxiety. "Do you think it's going to be okay?" he asked, glancing at Elisa, who was calmly sipping water despite the storm of emotions inside her. Elisa nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. "Of course, it's just pre-birth jitters." But even as she said it, Elisa felt a jolt, a sharp, undeniable movement in her belly, as though the baby was responding to her words. She winced slightly, causing Marco to rush to her side. "Are you okay? Should I call the doctor?" Marco's voice betrayed his panic. "It's fine," Elisa said quickly. "Just another kick. The baby's been active all morning." But she knew this was no ordinary kick. It felt purposeful, deliberate, almost as if the child inside her was trying to communicate. She brushed it off, chalking it up to her imagination running wild. The hours passed, and Elisa's contractions began. Nurses arrived to prep her for delivery, their voices calm and encouraging as they wheeled her into the delivery room. Dr. Evans, a seasoned obstetrician with decades of experience, greeted Elisa with his usual warm demeanor. "Elisa, Marco, it's showtime," he said with a grin, adjusting his gloves. "Let's bring this baby into the world." As the delivery began, everything appeared to progress normally. Elisa pushed through the pain with remarkable strength, encouraged by Marco's unwavering presence at her side. But just as the baby's head began to crown, something strange happened. The room grew colder, as though an invisible chill had crept in. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly, causing the nurses to exchange uneasy glances. Dr. Evans paused for a moment, his brow furrowing, but he quickly resumed his focus on delivering the baby. "Almost there, Elisa," he said, his voice steady. "One more big push." Elisa summoned every ounce of her strength, and with a final push, the baby entered the world. But instead of the usual cries of a newborn, the room was met with stunned silence. The nurses froze, their eyes widening in shock as they gazed at the baby. What is that?" one of the younger nurses whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Evans held the newborn in his hands, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. The baby, a beautiful boy with a healthy weight and perfect features, had glowing red eyes. They weren't just reflecting the overhead lights. No, they emitted their own radiant, otherworldly glow, pulsating softly as though alive with energy. Elisa, exhausted but alert, lifted her head. "Why isn't he crying? Is he okay?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Dr. Evans quickly regained his composure, wrapping the baby in a blanket and placing him on Elisa's chest. "He's fine," he said, though his tone lacked its usual confidence. "He's perfectly healthy." Elisa stared down at her son, her breath catching in her throat. The glowing eyes were impossible to ignore, yet they didn't frighten her. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection, as though those eyes were peering into her very soul. Marco, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. What's wrong with his eyes?" he stammered, stepping back slightly. "Why are they glowing like that?" Before Dr. Evans could respond, the baby let out his first cry, a powerful, echoing wail that seemed to reverberate through the room. The lights flickered again, and the monitors around them briefly spiked with static before returning to normal. The cry wasn't just loud, it was commanding, almost otherworldly, and it sent a chill down everyone's spine. The nurses exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. One of them, a senior nurse named Linda, stepped forward. "Doctor, should we run some tests?" she asked cautiously. Dr. Evans hesitated. He had delivered thousands of babies in his career, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. "Yes," he said finally. "Let's run a full set of tests. But let's keep this quiet for now. No need to alarm anyone." Elisa clutched her son tightly, her maternal instincts kicking in. "No tests," she said firmly. "He's my baby and he's fine. Whatever this is, it's not something to be treated like a problem." "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Evans began gently, "I understand your concern, but we need to ensure there's nothing medically wrong." "There's nothing wrong with him," Elisa interrupted, her voice stronger than she expected. "Look at him. He's perfect." Marco, still reeling, stepped closer. "Elisa, I think the doctor's right. We should at least check." "No," Elisa said again, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He's staying with me." Dr. Evans nodded slowly, respecting her wishes. "All right," he said. "We'll give you some time. But if you notice anything unusual, please let us know immediately." As the medical team filed out of the room, whispering among themselves, Elisa was left alone with Marco and their son. The baby had stopped crying and was now gazing up at his mother, his glowing eyes soft and mesmerizing. Marco sat down beside her, his hands trembling. "Elisa, what's happening? This isn't normal." "I don't know," Elisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't care. He's our son, Marco. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." Marco nodded reluctantly, though the unease in his eyes remained. For the rest of the night, the couple stayed by their baby's side, watching him sleep peacefully as the glow from his eyes dimmed to a faint shimmer. But outside their room, the hospital buzzed with speculation. Word of the glowing-eyed baby spread among the staff, and whispers of the miracle baby filled the halls. Some believed it was a medical anomaly, while others whispered about supernatural explanations. Dr. Evans, ever the scientist, began researching possible causes, poring over medical journals and consulting colleagues in secret. As the days passed, the world outside the hospital began to take notice. A nurse had snapped a photo of the baby against protocol and shared it with a friend, who then shared it online. Within hours, the image went viral, sparking a media frenzy. News outlets, scientists, and conspiracy theorists alike were all clamoring for answers. For Elisa and Marco, the sudden attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside the hospital, and strangers sent messages claiming to know the truth about their baby. Some hailed him as a miracle, while others labeled him a danger. The couple found themselves at the center of a storm they hadn't asked for, desperately trying to protect their son from the prying eyes of the world. But amidst the chaos, one question loomed larger than any other. What did the glowing eyes mean? And why did Elisa feel, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning of something far greater? As the days turned into weeks, the world's fascination with Elisa's baby grew uncontrollable. The photo of the glowing-eyed infant was splashed across news networks, blogs, and social media platforms. Headlines ranged from "Miracle Baby Born with Glowing Eyes Stuns Scientists" to "Alien Child?" Doctors left speechless at unexplained birth. Conspiracy theorists spun wild tales about extraterrestrial genetics, government experiments, and even prophecies from ancient texts. For Elisa and Marco, the attention was suffocating. The hospital attempted to shield them from the chaos, stationing extra security and limiting access to their room. Dr. Evans remained their point of contact, providing updates on the tests he had quietly run on the baby's blood and DNA. Every result came back normal. No abnormalities, no genetic mutations, nothing to explain the glowing eyes or the strange energy that seemed to radiate from the child. Everything points to him being a perfectly healthy baby, Dr. Evans told Elisa during one of his visits. But I've consulted with colleagues around the country, and none of us have seen anything like this before. There's no scientific explanation. Maybe there isn't supposed to be one, Elisa replied. She cradled her son, whom they had named Elias, close to her chest. His eyes, now a gentle, pulsing glow, seemed to calm her as much as they unnerved others. Maybe he's just special? Marco, sitting nearby, shook his head. Special doesn't explain what's happening, Elisa. People are camped outside our house, reporters won't leave us alone, and the government is probably watching us by now. This isn't normal. It's dangerous. Elisa met his gaze, her expression unwavering. He's our son, Marco. Whatever this is, we'll protect him. No matter what. Marco wanted to argue, but he couldn't deny the fierce love in Elisa's voice. He sighed and nodded, resigning himself to the uncertainty of their situation. Outside the hospital, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. Protesters and believers alike gathered, holding signs that ranged from "Praise the Miracle Child" to "Protect Humanity from the Unknown." Scientists clamored for a chance to study the baby, while religious leaders debated whether Elias was a divine sign or something to fear. The hospital staff did their best to maintain order, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Elisa and Marco decided it was time to leave. They couldn't stay in the hospital forever, and they hoped that returning home would provide some semblance of normalcy. But the journey back was anything but normal. As their car pulled out of the hospital's underground parking lot, they were met with a swarm of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. Security guards held back the crowd, but the flashing cameras and shouting voices were overwhelming. Elisa clutched Elias tightly, shielding him from the chaos as Marco navigated through the throng. "Just keep your head down," Marco said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We'll be home soon." When they finally reached their house, they found it surrounded by a sea of people. Some held candles and prayed, others chanted slogans, and a few waved signs accusing the family of harboring an alien or a demon. Marco's temper flared as he parked the car. "This is insane," he muttered. "We can't live like this." Elisa remained calm, her focus solely on Elias. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "We always do." Inside the house, the couple quickly realized how much their lives had changed. The phone rang constantly, and emails flooded in from strangers around the world. Offers came pouring in, scientists wanting to study Elias, media outlets promising money for exclusive interviews, and even shady individuals claiming to have answers about the baby's condition. Elisa ignored them all. Her only concern was protecting her son. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to happen. Lights in the house flickered unpredictably, and electronic devices behaved erratically whenever Elias was nearby. At first, Marco dismissed it as coincidence, but it became harder to ignore when their television turned on by itself one night, displaying static before cutting to a blank screen. "Did you see that?" Marco asked, his voice shaking. Elisa nodded, holding Elias close. "It's him," she said quietly. "I think he's doing it." Marco stared at her, incredulous. "How is that even possible?" "I don't know," Elisa admitted. "But it's like I can feel him controlling things. Not on purpose, but just by being here." Marco ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she was saying. "Elisa, this is too much. We need help. We can't handle this alone." But before they could discuss it further, there was a knock at the door. Marco peeked through the window and groaned. "It's another reporter," he said. "I'll handle it." He opened the door to find a man in a suit standing on the porch. He wasn't holding a microphone or a camera, but there was an air of authority about him. "Mr. Martinez?" the man asked, his tone calm but firm. "Who's asking?" Marco replied warily. "My name is Agent Reynolds," the man said, flashing a badge. "I'm with a government agency tasked with investigating unusual phenomena. We'd like to speak with you about your son." Marco stiffened. "We're not interested," he said, starting to close the door. But Agent Reynolds placed a hand on the doorframe, stopping him. "Mr. Martinez, I understand your hesitation," he said. "But this isn't just about your family. Your son's condition could have implications far beyond what you realize. We're here to help." Marco hesitated, glancing back at Elisa, who had come to stand behind him with Elias in her arms. "We don't need your help," she said firmly. "We're fine." Agent Reynolds studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I understand," he said, stepping back. "But if you change your mind, here's my card." He handed it to Marco and walked away, disappearing into the crowd outside. As soon as the door closed, Marco turned to Elisa. "What if he's right?" he asked. "What if Elias is, I don't know, connected to something bigger?" Elisa shook her head. "I don't care," she said. "He's our son, Marco. That's all that matters." But deep down, even Elisa couldn't ignore the feeling that their lives were no longer their own. Whatever the truth about Elias's glowing eyes, it was only a matter of time before the world demanded answers. The following days brought more inexplicable events. It wasn't just the flickering lights or static on the television anymore. Neighbors began noticing strange occurrences, too. A car stalled abruptly in front of their house, and the driver swore that their radio emitted static every time they tried to restart it. A mailman dropped a package on their doorstep, only to claim he felt a vibration in the air around the home, as if something unseen was humming. Elisa noticed it most profoundly when she held Elias. Whenever he gazed at her with his glowing eyes, a calm warmth enveloped her, as though the world's chaos couldn't penetrate that moment. But she also noticed something unusual. His eyes seemed to glow more intensely during these moments, as if their connection amplified the phenomenon. Marco, however, was growing restless. His concern for their safety had reached its peak. "Elisa, we can't keep pretending everything is fine," he said one night after putting Elias to sleep. "Look at what's happening around us. People are starting to talk. Neighbors, strangers on the street. Someone's going to take matters into their own hands." Elisa rubbed her temples, exhaustion etched into her face. "And what do you suggest we do? Let the government take him? Turn him into some kind of experiment?" "No, Marco. He's our son. We keep him safe no matter what." "I'm not saying we hand him over," Marco argued. "But maybe we should at least talk to someone who knows more about this kind of thing. A scientist, a researcher, anyone who can help us understand what's going on." Elisa hesitated. She hated the idea of exposing Elias to more scrutiny, but Marco wasn't wrong. They were out of their depth. "Fine," she relented. "But on our terms. No labs, no experiments. We'll find someone we trust." The couple spent the next few days researching specialists, people who studied rare phenomena, unexplained occurrences, and the intersection of science and spirituality. One name kept coming up: Dr. Sophia Monroe, a renowned physicist and author known for her open-minded approach to the unknown. She had a reputation for balancing rigorous scientific inquiry with empathy and respect for her subjects. Elisa reached out to Dr. Monroe, explaining their situation in vague terms over a secure email. To her surprise, Dr. Monroe responded within hours, expressing genuine interest and offering to meet in a neutral location. The couple agreed, arranging to meet her at a quiet cafe a few towns over. When the day arrived, Marco carried Elias in a covered baby carrier to avoid attracting attention. Dr. Monroe was already waiting when they arrived. A woman in her 40s with sharp features, kind eyes, and a notebook resting on the table in front of her. "Thank you for meeting us," Elisa said, her voice tinged with apprehension. Dr. Monroe smiled warmly. "Of course. I understand this must be difficult for you, but I want you to know that my goal is to help, not exploit your situation." Marco set the baby carrier on the table, and Elias stirred inside. Dr. Monroe leaned forward slightly, her curiosity evident. "May I see him?" she asked gently. Elisa hesitated but eventually unzipped the carrier, revealing Elias's face. His eyes were closed, but even through his eyelids, a faint glow was visible. Dr. Monroe's breath hitched, and she quickly composed herself. "I've read about phenomena like this, but seeing it in person is remarkable," she said. "Do you mind if I ask some questions?" Elisa and Marco nodded, and Dr. Monroe began her inquiry. She asked about the pregnancy, Elias's birth, the glowing eyes, and the strange events that had followed. Elisa recounted everything in detail, her voice steady but laced with emotion. After an hour of discussion, Dr. Monroe leaned back in her chair, deep in thought. "I've studied electromagnetic anomalies, bioelectric fields, and even cases of luminescence in living organisms," she said. "But what you're describing goes beyond anything I've encountered. It's as if Elias emits a form of energy that interacts with his surroundings in ways we don't fully understand. Can you help us? Marco asked, his desperation evident. Dr. Monroe nodded. I'd like to try, but we'll need to proceed carefully. This kind of phenomenon has a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention. As if on cue, a loud crash shattered the relative peace of the cafe. The couple turned to see a man with a camera pressed against the window, snapping photos of them and Elias. Elisa gasped and instinctively shielded her son, while Marco sprang to his feet, shouting at the man to leave. The commotion drew a small crowd, and before they knew it, more people were gathering outside, craning their necks to see the miracle baby. Dr. Monroe acted quickly, ushering them out through the cafe's back exit. We need to get you somewhere safe, she said, her voice firm. They hurried to Dr. Monroe's car, and she drove them to her private research facility, a secluded property surrounded by tall trees and equipped with state-of-the-art technology. You can stay here for as long as you need, she said. No one will find you here. Elisa and Marco were reluctant to trust her fully, but they had little choice. They settled into the guest quarters, grateful for the reprieve from the outside world. Over the next few days, Dr. Monroe conducted non-invasive tests on Elias, using advanced imaging equipment and sensors to analyze the energy field surrounding him. What she discovered left her stunned. Elias's body emits a unique electromagnetic frequency, she explained to Elisa and Marco during one of their late-night discussions. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's as if his very presence alters the energy around him. This could explain the flickering lights and other phenomena you've experienced. But why? Marco asked. Why is he like this? Dr. Monroe hesitated before answering. I don't know, she admitted. It could be genetic, environmental, or something else entirely. But one thing is clear, Elias is extraordinary, and that makes him a target. Her words sent a chill through the room. Marco clenched his fists, his protective instincts kicking in. Then we'll protect him, he said. Whatever it takes. Dr. Monroe nodded, her expression somber. You'll need to, because the world isn't ready for Elias. And I'm afraid some people will do whatever it takes to control what they don't understand. As the gravity of their situation sank in, Elisa held Elias close, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she would do anything to keep her son safe. As days passed in Dr. Monroe's secluded facility, Elias's abilities seemed to evolve. The energy he emitted became more pronounced, affecting everything around him in unexpected ways. Plants in the room where he slept grew at an accelerated rate, their leaves greener and more vibrant than ever before. Electronics, however, were another story. Devices often malfunctioned or shut down entirely when he was nearby. Dr. Monroe continued her research, documenting every detail meticulously. One evening, Elisa and Marco sat with Dr. Monroe in her study, watching footage of Elias captured on her infrared camera. The screen displayed swirling patterns of energy radiating from the baby, creating a mesmerizing visual. This isn't just electromagnetic energy, Dr. Monroe said, her voice filled with awe. It's something more. It's almost as if he's communicating with his environment on a level we can't perceive. Elisa stared at the screen, her maternal instincts telling her that Elias's abilities were both a gift and a burden. Do you think he knows what he's doing? She asked softly. Dr. Monroe shook her head. At this age, it's unlikely. But as he grows, he may gain some control over it. That's why it's crucial to keep him safe and help him understand his abilities. Marco leaned forward, his expression serious. And what happens if someone finds out about him? What if the wrong people come looking? Dr. Monroe hesitated, then said, I've taken precautions to keep your location secure, but I can't guarantee your safety forever. There are always people who see something extraordinary and want to exploit it. Her words hung heavy in the air, and Elisa felt a surge of anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They needed a plan, a way to ensure Elias's safety in the long term. The next morning, Elisa woke to find Marco staring out the window, his jaw clenched. What's wrong? She asked, approaching him. Marco turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. We can't stay here forever, Elisa. We need to think about what's next. How do we protect Elias while giving him a chance to grow up like a normal child? Elisa nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of leaving the sanctuary Dr. Monroe had provided. "You're right," she said. "But where do we go? How do we keep him hidden?" Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion outside. Dr. Monroe burst into the room, her face pale. "We have a problem," she said. "Someone's breached the perimeter. They found us." Panic surged through Elisa and Marco as they grabbed Elias and followed Dr. Monroe to the basement, where she had set up a secure hiding space. "Stay here," she instructed. "I'll handle this." Through a small monitor in the basement, they watched as two men in dark suits confronted Dr. Monroe at the gate. The men claimed to be government agents, flashing badges and demanding access to her facility. "We've received reports of unusual activity in this area," one of them said. "We need to investigate." Dr. Monroe remained calm but firm. "This is private property, and you have no warrant. Unless you can provide legal documentation, I suggest you leave." The men exchanged a glance, clearly frustrated. "We'll be back," one of them said before they retreated. Back in the basement, Elisa held Elias tightly, her mind racing. "They're not going to stop," she whispered. "They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Marco placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we need to leave. Tonight." Dr. Monroe returned to the basement, her expression grim. "They'll likely come back with reinforcements," she said. "But I have a plan. There's a safe house in another state, completely off the grid. I can get you there." Elisa and Marco exchanged a glance, both understanding the gravity of the situation. They had no choice but to trust Dr. Monroe and her plan. Under the cover of darkness, they packed their belongings and prepared to leave. Dr. Monroe provided them with fake identification and a detailed route to the safe house. "Once you're there, stay hidden," she advised. "I'll continue my research and find a way to help you from afar." As they drove away, Elisa couldn't help but look back at the facility that had been their refuge. She felt a pang of guilt for leaving Dr. Monroe behind, but she knew it was the right decision for Elias's safety. The journey to the safe house was fraught with tension. Marco drove cautiously, taking back roads and avoiding populated areas. Elisa sat in the back seat with Elias, soothing him whenever he became fussy. Despite the fear that gnawed at her, she felt a flicker of hope. They were taking control of their fate, doing everything they could to protect their son. When they finally arrived at the safe house, a small cabin deep in the woods, they were greeted by a man named Ben, an old friend of Dr. Monroe's. He was a retired scientist who had spent years living off the grid. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm but tinged with sadness. "You'll be safe here." The cabin was modest but well-equipped, with solar panels, a water filtration system, and enough supplies to last for months. Ben showed them around, explaining how everything worked. "I'll check in on you occasionally," he said. "But for the most part, you'll be on your own." As the days turned into weeks, Elisa and Marco adjusted to their new life in the woods. It wasn't easy, every noise outside made them jump, and they missed the comforts of their old life, but they found solace in their time together as a family. Elias, too, seemed to thrive in the peaceful environment. The woods around the cabin were untouched by his energy, allowing them to live without constant disruptions. But Elisa couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary reprieve. They had escaped for now, but the world wouldn't forget about Elias. Sooner or later, they would have to face the challenges that awaited them. For now, though, they focused on each day as it came, cherishing the moments of peace and the bond they shared as a family. No matter what the future held, they knew one thing for certain: they would face it together. The days at the cabin began to form a rhythm. Elisa and Marco embraced the simplicity of life in the woods, far removed from the chaos that had uprooted their world. Each morning, they took turns exploring the nearby trails, ensuring that the area remained undisturbed. The tranquility was a stark contrast to the tension they had left behind, but it also served as a constant reminder of their isolation. Elias, now a few months old, continued to grow at an astounding rate. His glowing eyes, once intermittent, were now a regular feature, casting a soft light in the dimly lit cabin. Marco fashioned blackout curtains for the windows to ensure that no stray light would betray their location at night. While Elias's abilities seemed more stable, the occasional burst of energy still left them on edge. One evening, as the family sat by the fireplace, Ben paid them a visit. He brought with him a small crate of supplies and some news from the outside world. "Dr. Monroe is safe," he said, setting the crate down. "She's working on a way to help you long-term. But there's a growing interest in, well, anomalies like Elias." Elisa's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Ben hesitated, his weathered face creasing with concern. "There have been reports in scientific circles about unexplained phenomena, people who've seen things, like children with unusual abilities. It's creating a stir. Governments, private organizations, they're all starting to look for answers." Marco clenched his fists. "So we're not just running from the government anymore. We're running from anyone who might see Elias as some kind of experiment." Ben nodded grimly. "That's why I came tonight. I have a plan, but it's risky." The room fell silent as Ben outlined his idea. He suggested creating a diversion, a false trail that would lead any potential pursuers far away from the cabin. "I'll plant evidence suggesting you fled to Canada," he explained. "It'll buy you time, but it won't last forever." Elisa and Marco exchanged a glance. The idea was risky, but they knew they couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. "Do it," Marco said firmly. "Whatever it takes to keep Elias safe." Over the next few days, Ben worked tirelessly to set his plan in motion. He left behind scraps of clothing, forged travel documents, and other clues to suggest that the family had crossed the border. Meanwhile, Elisa and Marco focused on preparing for the possibility that they might have to leave the cabin at a moment's notice. Elisa found herself growing increasingly anxious. The quiet of the woods, once soothing, now felt oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though Marco assured her it was just her imagination. One night, as a storm raged outside, Elias began to cry. His energy flared, causing the lights in the cabin to flicker. Elisa rocked him gently, whispering soothing words, but the energy continued to build. Marco grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around Elias, trying to muffle the glow that emanated from him. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Elisa and Marco froze. They hadn't heard anyone approach, and the storm should have masked any sound. Marco motioned for Elisa to stay with Elias while he cautiously approached the door. Through the peephole, he saw a figure cloaked in a rain-soaked poncho. "Who's there?" Marco called out, his voice steady but firm. The figure hesitated before responding. "It's Ben." Marco opened the door just enough to let Ben inside, then quickly shut it behind him. Ben was drenched, his face pale. "We have a problem," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They found the trail I left. But something's not right. They're not government agents." "What do you mean?" Marco asked, his stomach sinking. Ben shook his head. "They're different. I don't know who they are, but they're well-funded and well-equipped. They're not just looking for Elias, they're looking for others like him." Elisa felt a chill run down her spine. "Others?" she asked. Are there more children like Elias?" Ben hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but it's possible. If Elias is part of something bigger, it might explain why they're so determined to find him." The room fell silent as the gravity of Ben's words sank in. Elisa clutched Elias tightly, her mind racing. If there were others like him, what did that mean for their family? And what would happen if these mysterious pursuers caught up to them? Ben stayed the night, keeping watch by the window while Marco and Elisa tried to get some rest. But sleep eluded them both. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within their minds, and the faint glow from Elias's eyes cast eerie shadows on the walls. The next morning, Ben pulled Marco aside. "We need to talk," he said. "There's a chance we might have to move you again. If they get too close, staying here won't be an option." Marco nodded, though the thought of uprooting their lives once more filled him with dread. "Do you have another safe house in mind?" Ben shook his head. "Not yet, but I'll find one. In the meantime, stay vigilant. If anything seems off, don't wait, leave immediately." As Ben left the cabin, Elisa watched him disappear into the woods, her heart heavy with worry. She turned to Marco, her voice trembling. "How much longer can we keep this up?" Marco pulled her into a comforting embrace. "As long as we have to," he said. We'll do whatever it takes to protect Elias." Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the cabin grew. Marco began teaching Elisa basic survival skills: how to navigate the woods, start a fire, and find edible plants. "Just in case," he said, though Elisa could see the fear behind his calm facade. Elias, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding them, continued to grow and develop. His energy bursts became less frequent but more intense, and Elisa noticed that he seemed to respond to her emotions. When she was calm, he was calm. But when she felt anxious or afraid, his energy flared. One evening, as Elisa rocked Elias to sleep, she whispered to him, "You're going to do great things one day, my love. I don't know what's ahead, but I know you'll change the world." Her words hung in the air, a quiet promise to her extraordinary son. The nights in the cabin grew colder as winter approached, and the isolation weighed heavily on Elisa and Marco. Their world had shrunk to the size of the woods surrounding them, with every sound outside the cabin setting their nerves on edge. Despite the tension, Elias continued to grow, his glowing eyes now a constant presence in their lives. What had once been a source of fear and confusion was now something Elisa regarded with awe and fierce protectiveness. But the peace was fragile. One evening, as the family sat by the fireplace, a faint hum filled the air. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind outside, but it grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the cabin. Marco stiffened, his instincts immediately on high alert. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Elisa nodded, holding Elias close. "What is it?" Marco moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The woods were still, but the hum persisted, growing stronger. Suddenly, a bright light flashed in the distance, illuminating the treetops. Marco cursed under his breath. "We need to leave." "No." Elisa hesitated, her grip on Elias tightening. "What if it's Ben? What if he's trying to warn us?" Marco shook his head. "Ben wouldn't do this. He'd use the signal he showed us. This is something else." They quickly packed a few essentials, warm clothes, food, and the documents Ben had given them, and slipped out the back door, careful to avoid the beams of light that now scanned the area. The hum grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of voices. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be subtle. As they moved through the woods, Elisa's heart pounded in her chest. Elias, sensing her fear, began to whimper. His eyes glowed brighter, casting a soft light that made it harder for them to stay hidden. "Shoo, baby," Elisa whispered, trying to soothe him. "It's okay. We're going to be okay." Marco led the way, his movements deliberate and silent. He had memorized the escape routes Ben had shown them, but the presence of the searchlights made it harder to navigate. Every crack of a branch underfoot felt deafening, and every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small cave that Ben had identified as a potential hideout. Marco helped Elisa inside, then crouched by the entrance, keeping watch. The lights and voices grew fainter, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the search party expanded its perimeter. Inside the cave, Elias's glow dimmed slightly, as if he sensed the need to stay hidden. Elisa kissed his forehead, tears streaming down her face. "You're so brave, my sweet boy," she whispered. "We'll keep you safe. I promise." Marco turned to her, his expression grim. "We can't stay here long. Once they realize we're not in the cabin, they'll start searching the surrounding area." Elisa nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll move as soon as it's safe. But where do we go? We can't keep running forever." Marco didn't have an answer. The weight of their predicament pressed down on him, but he refused to let it show. "One step at a time," he said. "We'll figure it out." As the hours passed, the hum and searchlights gradually disappeared. The woods fell silent once more, but the fear lingered. Marco ventured outside to scout the area, returning with news that the immediate threat had passed. "They've moved on," he said. "But we need to keep moving. They'll be back." The family resumed their journey through the woods, heading toward a location Ben had mentioned, a remote cabin deeper in the wilderness, far from any roads or towns. It was their best chance at staying hidden, but the journey was long and treacherous. As they trudged through the forest, Elisa felt a strange sense of déjà vu. She couldn't explain it, but something about the path they were taking felt familiar, as though she had walked it before in a dream. She shook off the feeling, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. Elias, cradled against her chest, began to glow faintly once more. This time, however, the light seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. It was comforting, almost as if Elias was trying to reassure her. He knows, she thought. He knows we're trying to protect him. Hours later, they reached the remote cabin. It was smaller than their previous hideout, with only one room and minimal supplies, but it offered shelter and, most importantly, seclusion. Marco checked the perimeter, ensuring there were no signs of recent activity, before ushering Elisa and Elias inside. The cabin was cold and dark, but it felt safer than the open woods. Marco lit a small fire, and Elisa set Elias down on a makeshift bed. The baby stared up at her with his glowing eyes, his expression serene despite the chaos around them. As they settled in for the night, Marco and Elisa talked in hushed tones, strategizing their next move. They knew they couldn't rely on Ben forever and that they needed a long-term solution. "We need to find somewhere permanent," Marco said. "Somewhere they'll never think to look." Elisa nodded, though she couldn't imagine where such a place might be. "We'll figure it out," she said, echoing Marco's earlier words. "We have to." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. Elias's abilities were growing stronger, and with them, the dangers seemed to increase. She wondered if they would ever truly be able to protect him, or if the world would always see him as a mystery to be solved. The remote cabin provided a brief respite, but it didn't take long for the tension to creep back in. Marco spent his days reinforcing the cabin's defenses, rigging makeshift alarms around the perimeter to alert them to any intruders. Elisa focused on caring for Elias, her every action fueled by a fierce determination to keep him safe. But the isolation weighed heavily on them, and the constant threat of discovery loomed over every moment. Elias continued to grow at an unusual rate, his abilities becoming more pronounced. The glow from his eyes now carried a warmth that seemed to affect the space around him. Plants in the cabin thrived unnaturally, and even the fire burned brighter when Elias was near. Marco joked once that Elias had turned the cabin into a magical greenhouse, but the weight of their reality quickly silenced any levity. One night, as the family sat by the fire, a faint knock echoed through the cabin. Elisa and Marco froze, their eyes locking. No one should have been able to find them here. Marco reached for the rifle Ben had left them, motioning for Elisa to stay behind. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "It's Ben," came the familiar voice from the other side of the door. Marco hesitated, his instincts screaming to be cautious. "How do I know it's really you?" he asked. There was a pause, and then Ben said, "The first night you arrived at the cabin, I told you about the stars. Do you remember what I said?" Marco lowered the rifle slightly, relief washing over him. He opened the door to find Ben standing there, his face lined with exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" Marco asked, stepping aside to let him in. Ben entered quickly, closing the door behind him. "I came to warn you," he said. "They're getting closer. The false trail worked for a while, but it won't hold them off much longer. You need to move." Elisa joined them, holding Elias in her arms. "Move where?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We can't keep running forever." Ben's expression softened. "I know it's not fair," he said, "but there's a place, a safe haven. It's not easy to reach, but once you're there, no one will be able to find you." "What kind of place?" Marco asked, skepticism creeping into his tone. "It's a community," Ben explained. "Off the grid, hidden from the outside world. They specialize in helping people like you, people with extraordinary circumstances. I've only been there once, but I can guide you." Elisa and Marco exchanged a look. The idea of a safe haven was tempting, but it also felt too good to be true. "How do we know we can trust them?" Elisa asked. "You don't," Ben admitted. "But I've vetted them as much as I can. They're your best chance." The couple fell silent, weighing their options. Finally, Marco nodded. "We'll go," he said. "But if anything feels off, we're leaving." The journey to the safe haven was long and arduous. Ben led them through dense forests and rugged terrain, avoiding roads and settlements to ensure they weren't followed. Elias, surprisingly, remained calm throughout the journey, his glowing eyes providing just enough light to guide them in the dark. After days of travel, they reached the edge of a valley shrouded in mist. Ben stopped, gesturing to the scene before them. "It's down there," he said. "The entrance is hidden, but they'll find us before we find them." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the mist, a woman with an air of quiet authority. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the group. "You must be Ben," she said. "And this must be the family you told us about." Ben nodded. "This is Elisa, Marco, and Elias. They need your help." The woman studied Elias, her expression unreadable. "You'll be safe here," she said finally. "Follow me." The safe haven was unlike anything Elisa and Marco had imagined. It was a self-sustaining community, hidden beneath the forest canopy and shielded by advanced technology that blocked outside signals. The people there greeted them warmly, their demeanor kind but guarded. Elisa noticed that many of them seemed different. Some had unusual eyes or faint glows, while others moved with an otherworldly grace. "Are they like Elias?" she asked Ben quietly. "Some of them," Ben replied. "Not exactly, but similar. This place was built for people who don't fit into the world outside. They'll take care of you." The family was given a small cabin and integrated into the community. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of stability. Elias seemed at peace, his abilities no longer a source of fear but a connection to others like him. The people in the safe haven treated him with reverence, as though he were a symbol of hope. But even in this sanctuary, Elisa and Marco couldn't fully relax. They knew the outside world hadn't forgotten about Elias, and the mystery of his abilities still loomed over them. Dr. Monroe, who had managed to contact them through Ben, continued her research from afar, determined to uncover the truth. As time passed, Elisa began to see Elias's abilities not as a curse but as a gift. She realized that his glowing eyes, once a source of fear and confusion, were a beacon, a reminder of the extraordinary potential within him. One evening, as she watched Elias play with other children in the community, she turned to Marco. "We've come so far," she said, "and I finally feel like we're where we're meant to be." Marco nodded, his gaze fixed on their son. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together," he said. "As a family." Elisa smiled, holding his hand tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but they had found a place where Elias could grow and thrive, a place where his differences were celebrated, not feared. And though the future remained uncertain, Elisa knew one thing for sure: Elias was destined for greatness. His glowing eyes, a symbol of the unknown, held the promise of something extraordinary, a light that would guide them through whatever lay ahead.